Good evening, everyone. Rousing response there. I know it's a long day. It's a long day for me. Today was my criminal sentencing day. And on Wednesdays, that's when I see people, and some go to prison, unfortunately. Some don't go to prison. We have other outcomes as well. But it's not a very happy day, but it is a day that must be addressed. And it's probably an appropriate time for me to come and speak to you tonight because I have a couple of stories from today that I think are relevant to what I'm going to talk about tonight. I was asked to come to speak about the criminal justice system as it relates to drug addiction, drug treatment, fighting the epidemic, if we can actually call it that. And maybe we'll talk a little bit later because we may see this word overused recently. Not to say that we don't have problems, but when we look at some of the questions and the answers you see later, the actual facts and figures may differ from public perception about some of these things. But I'm part of the criminal justice system. I am a common pleas judge in Hancock County, Ohio. I've been there in that position for 17 years. 10 years prior to that, I was a municipal court judge. Municipal court judges hear misdemeanor cases, and unfortunately for college students, that's where they usually go if they get in trouble, if something happens, a speeding ticket, an OVI, something. And I used to see a lot of University of Findlay students in those days, Findlay College students back in my days at municipal court. When I moved over 17 years ago to common pleas court, common pleas judges have jurisdiction over felony cases, and that's where almost every drug case lands. There are some misdemeanor drug offenses out there, but by and large, especially when we're talking about our major drugs, which are on Schedule I, such as heroin, marijuana, LSD, and other Schedule II controlled substances, which are most of our prescribed or prescription drugs, those cases come to Judge Niemeyer and myself, and he and I split that docket along with handling a lot of other matters, including domestic relations cases, civil cases, and the like. But we see, for Hancock County, we see the focus, we see the drug cases that we're going to talk about. And I've decided I was trying to figure out a topic that might be appropriate, so this is something that we encounter and need to talk about, and that is that there is an interface between my system, the criminal justice system, and the treatment community, because so many times what we're trying to do is we're trying to affect change. We're trying to help people become sober. We're trying to get them off of prescription drugs, addictive drugs, alcohol, whatever the case may be, because for most of them, that has led to their problems, and we'll wrap that around one of the other questions I asked you about the indictments that I see. And unfortunately, but we're working on this, and unfortunately, these systems don't meld well together. We collide, hence the picture of the two planets colliding, because there's difference between what we do. Some of it is institutional, some of it may be philosophical, some of it just can't be helped because of the different approaches that each system takes toward addiction and sobriety. And I see some puzzled looks on people's faces, but that's the way the world works, and I'm going to explain why it works that way in a moment. So we'll talk about that. That's a picture of me taken a couple days ago, but did Allison, I think the Courier took that, didn't it? Okay. There are some common assumptions that our system, the criminal justice system, has been working with for centuries. And we're going to get back and talk about that because I asked you what the purpose of punishment was. And you had a lot of choices there: deterrence, rehabilitation, punishment, and the like. And our system was born really out of the Enlightenment and some English thinkers, and we moved it over. And it has at its root, at its base, the notion that all of us are rational creatures. And if given certain options, we'll pick the better option of the bunch. So, we operate first under the assumption that if the Ohio legislature makes some form of conduct a crime, that people will not violate that law. That they will make a decision. If I can see that the store attendant's not there, the cash drawer is open, I could just as easily, within 2 seconds, reach over and grab the money out of the till, take it and run, and no one would ever be the wiser. And that's the little devil on the shoulder, right? And on the other side is the little angel that says, wait a minute, first of all, that's wrong. It's inappropriate. It's immoral. Secondly, what if I get caught? I'm going to be punished. Is it really worth it? So the idea in our system as it began was we balance these interests as people and we make the right decisions because we don't want to violate the law. We don't want to go before someone like me. We don't want to go before someone like that, and we don't want to be punished. Okay. That may be true in some instances, but as we're going to fast forward in a moment, that is absolutely not true when we're talking about drug offenses, because people are not acting in that rational manner as we would wish them to under those circumstances. That's the first assumption. Perhaps the more frightening assumption is the second assumption we operate under, and that is that if someone does break the law and does come before a judge and does have that judge punish them, that they will never do it again. That's not true either. So our system's predicated on these two fundamental principles, which at least in the world of drug addiction, in the area of drug laws, doesn't hold true because that's not the way people operate. That just isn't how the brain functions under those circumstances. So my world comes with these two notions in mind. And they worked a long time, and they work in they do work in some areas. I think people do obey the law under certain circumstances because they fear that they may be punished. Also, the law sets sort of a moral bar for all of us, and I think most of us want to do the right thing, so we act in accordance with general social norms, but those are the assumptions that we work under. But we do have the real world. And most criminal offenses are now the result of drug and alcohol use, abuse, dependence, or addiction, whichever terminology fits the appropriate circumstance. And we see a lot of these terms that are thrown around. And as we have tried to address these problems, especially as we began long before most of you were ever born, the war on drugs was started in the 1970s when Richard Nixon was the president. I assume all of you learned about Richard Nixon and the history of our presidents in high school and the like. He was a president in the 70s, and he began the war on drugs. It was followed up later by other presidents. Bill Clinton signed one of the most punitive criminal sentencing laws on the federal level in the 90s to escalate the war on drugs. If any of you have been following the news, we now see something you never see in Washington, which is a bipartisan effort to peel back some of these laws to end what's called mandatory minimum sentencing and to address some of these issues because we have a lot of folks in prison. I would have asked this question if I could have had more than 5, and I'll ask it now. What do you think is the national prison population, federal prisoners and all state prisoners combined? Not jail, but prisons. Anyone have an idea? In prisons, we incarcerate almost 1.4 million people. If you add jails, it's 2.4 million people. It was 300,000 in the 1970s. Now we're up to over 2.4 million. So if we go back and look at my questions, which we will in a moment, if you extrapolate, you can figure out what the right answer was. So we have done a lot to try and address these issues. And most of these laws were trying to address increased in illegal drug usage. And in those days, it was marijuana, LSD, and things related to that. Then it moved into cocaine, and now, as we'll talk about hopefully a little bit tonight, it's opiates and heroin. But for most of the last 40 years, the demand side, which is interdicting drugs, trying to figure out a way to keep drugs from getting into the United States, once they're here, trying to find them, to destroy them, that side has gotten most of the attention. In the last 40-some years, on average, the demand side, meaning drug interdiction, has garnered about 70% of all funding, and 30% has gone to the treatment side. That's starting to change, though. We're now seeing that people realize that perhaps if we work on the other side of it, and that is we work on treatment and try, and I meant supply side, but we worked on the supply side. If we work on the demand side and work with people who have addiction problems and we can create better models to deal with sobriety, then we may not have to worry about these interdiction efforts and other efforts, because it's like if you're standing on a street corner and you have a bunch of apples. If nobody's interested, you can have them all day long. They're not going to be sold and they're not going to be in commerce. So working on the demand side might be helpful. So that, is actually in there. That should be the supply side has garnered most of the attention of the funding, and now we've gone to the other side. Also, what is fascinating, and I've been spending a lot of my own personal time since I have a drug court now, is trying to learn the most I can about the science of drug addiction. Because there's an incredible amount of science, and the more we learn about the brain, the more we learn how to deal with these issues, and we find that we're not just talking about a moral weakness on somebody's part, we're actually talking about a disease structure. However, the debate still rages on. And now we'll talk about a couple things, and I had a couple experiences today about these competing principles, because we have competing philosophies. So is it possible, Mike, that we can go back and look at the questions, or do we need to wait? All right. Let's go back and pull up question 1. All right. Okay. And can we get the results? I asked you what you thought the primary purpose of sentencing according to Ohio law is. 24 of you thought it was rehabilitation. And notice I used some very important language, primary purpose. So that my focus was on the primary focus, what I'm supposed to first do when I have someone who comes before me. General deterrence is the second one, and we talked about that. That is, I take action against one person. Many people read about it. They conform their behavior for fear that they might get in trouble and be punished. C, punishment. That's just good old-fashioned retribution. Good old-fashioned Old Testament, eye for an eye. You do something bad, we're going to do something to you. In our world now, in the old days, we used to do things like cut people's hands off. We actually tortured. But now we've become far more civilized and evolved, so our punishment is incarceration, separating people out from society, making them sacrifice. Specific deterrence is the notion that what I do to one person, if I put them out of society, at least I've removed them. So, for example, let's say there's somebody who's very violent and has a history of violent offenses, and he comes before me and I have to sentence him. I'm going to look at this factor. I'm going to say, I know that if I put him in prison for 2 years, there's at least 2 years that he's not going to harm anybody else. So I've at least taken him from this society. I've extracted him and put him somewhere else where he or she can't do any harm. So that's a benefit. Restitution has also been an issue over time. If I have someone before me, they've stolen all of your property from your dorm room, $4,000 or $5,000 worth of things. I can, when I get them before them, threaten them and coerce them and force them to pay you back, to make whole on what they've done. And in some societies, that's a very important aspect of punishment. But I see, by and large, no one picked specific performance and nobody picked restitution. Now, I have to be honest, I started you off with a trick question. Because under Ohio law, it's just not one of those. The overriding purposes and principles of sentencing in Ohio state, and I brought it with me, that I'm supposed to protect the public from future crime by the offender and others, so that would be specific and general deterrence, and I'm supposed to punish them for what they've done. So it's actually 3 of those 5. But notice what wasn't part of the overriding purposes and principles of sentencing. What wasn't part of it? Rehabilitation. Okay. Now, these principles were first put into effect in the 70s and became part of statutory law in 1996. They've been modified slightly, and there are some modifiers to this that were recently put into the code, but essentially they have remained the same. So when we talk about these worlds colliding, here's where they first collide. Because those that work in treatment are trying to get people what? Rehabilitated, sober, on the right track. Usually, not always, but all those who deal in treatment or know about treatment, you're not really interested and are not going to spend your time more than likely admonishing this person, are you? You're going to wag your finger at them and tell them how bad they are? You may. I mean, I know that can be part of it, but by and large, that's really not the focus of someone in the treatment camp. The goal is to find out what's going on, to find out what's wrong, in many cases discover what the underlying issues are, and we now know that trauma is at the base of most of all of what I see. Get to the core, work on programs, put people into treatment regimes, follow them closely, monitor their behavior, and hopefully over the course of time, work out of these problems, out of addiction, and back to a sober life. Now, that doesn't mean that I cannot consider rehabilitation. In fact, the law goes on to say that after I've considered these important factors, I can look at such things as incapacitation, rehabilitation, and restitution, but I have to comply with those first. Those are what the law says are the overarching things I'm to do first. So that's the first place where our worlds collide. My fundamental duty in life as a judge is to deter and to punish you. And if I can possibly do that with some rehabilitation, I can do it. But it has to be those two things that I do first and foremost. That can become a problem, especially when we have people who are going to talk a little bit more, because what drives a judge absolutely crazy is one word. Zach, do you know what that one word is? Relapse. Because people in recovery relapse. We don't like that in our world. That's not the way our world works, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Can we go back? Now, I was debating whether to talk about this, but it happened twice today, and my goal, Pressure, today is not to point fingers or to be mean or whatever, but there's also the flip side of this, because I'm giving you what's called the judicial mea culpa tonight. What's wrong with us and on our side of the ledger, and how we need really to come together and coalesce as two groups into one more unified group so we can actually really address addiction and the like. But to do that, we all have to be on the same page. And I have to be honest with you, and I won't dwell on this too much because it's my job to talk about criminal justice, but it's impossible not to speak to you about this, and that is that there's not really even that much unanimity in the treatment field on a variety of issues. There are members of the treatment community who are more punitive than, I guess, therapeutic in their approach, and I hear about that. And there's also a lack of unanimity in what approaches that I should take, because I do operate a drug court, and we do have a staffing every week. Well, if I get a moment, I'll talk to you about what's involved there. But we do have drug court here, and we're finding that in my field, I know there's not unanimity. Judges feel very differently and very strongly about these things, and they're entitled to have a huge amount of discretion on how they approach these. There's some judges that have no tolerance in drug cases. If you get caught with drugs, you're going to prison. If you get caught with drugs and you get on probation, one dirty urine test will send you to prison. It's pretty much a zero tolerance approach toward these things. There are others like myself who don't accept that proposition necessarily, and I think are more tolerant of an approach which ultimately leads to recovery and sees recovery sort of like this as opposed to a straight continuum. But it's also true with my colleagues in the treatment field that they're not always on the same page as to how they think I should approach certain cases. And also today, for example, I had a young lady who has been before me 3 or 4 times. It's always opiates. Started out with pain pills with a back problem, and this is something we see with great regularity now. Her doctor cut her off. She was still addicted, so now she found her way to heroin. It's very easy to get. It's inexpensive. And her path to addiction is unfortunately very common these days. It doesn't account for all of our problems, but it certainly accounts for a lot of them. And she's been on and off. She's tried a million things. She wanted to get Suboxone, which is a form of medically assisted treatment. And I don't know, Dr. Milks, have you talked about?
We talked a little bit about the partial agonists and also.
Okay. So she felt that Suboxone might help her. At the time she went to the clinic, and it was a privately operated clinic in our community. She went to the clinic, and when she checked in, she gave a drug specimen, and she was told that she couldn't have Suboxone, which helps fight addiction, opiate addiction. And she asked why, and she says, because I just tested your urine and you're clean. You have to be dirty. So what'd she do? She went out, found a friend, bought some heroin, took it, and came back and tested dirty so she could get on Suboxone. Now that's, if I'm the only one that think that's a perverse use of the system, maybe it's me, but this is what the clinic said that it had to do. The next person comes in is a young lady who is in drug court and who is a heroin user in the past who was on Vivitrol and then learned that she was pregnant. Her doctor immediately took her off Vivitrol for fear that it might have an impact on the fetus. The doctor elected not to put her on anything else. Subutex, Suboxone, any methadone. There are other treatments that have been proven to be helpful and effective for pregnant women who are addicted, but in this case, they did not. So she's been off for 6 weeks. She used last weekend. So we had a situation where she could have been given a prescription medication that would have possibly some impact upon her unborn child. She wasn't given it because the doctor didn't know or was uncertain about its usage, so she turned to heroin. So now we have a more difficult problem to address. So there is also a lot of disagreement and different approaches in the field itself, and when you compound that with the problems in the criminal justice system trying to coalesce around one approach to these issues, you see difficulties. I won't call it chaos. I won't say that it pervades the entirety of the system throughout the state, but there are pockets of these circumstances and situations that have to be addressed. Because for all the students that are out there, this is probably a quaint notion that people old as myself and perhaps Mr. Grotrain are familiar with, and that is that we always viewed drug addiction as a moral weakness. We didn't really understand. Now we know that, especially when we're talking about opiates and other matters, that it isn't just a matter of poor choices, freedom of choice, moral weakness, and the like. It's a much more complicated process than that. But in my world, the average age of all judges in the state of Ohio is 60. So it's a different generation, and the way that they look at things are different from someone who's 40, 20. My students that are here, is drug addiction a disease or a moral weakness? It's a disease. Now you're just saying that because I'm here? Why is it a disease? That's what the doctor told you? Okay. Well, do you think he's correct? Isn't it just someone like me who has a bad upbringing, can't figure out right from wrong? Is at a party, someone offers me something and I don't have the courage to say no? Because you'll hear these arguments all the time, and they invade and prevade legislative policy. And I want you to ask our representative, Mr. Sprague, about these issues, because some of these views still predominate in the legislature. Because why wouldn't my purposes and principles of sentencing change now, especially since we have so many drug problems and we know that it's more than that? Why haven't we kicked up the idea of rehabilitation into the first three, if not the first one? But we haven't. It's been the law since 1996. The answer is most people think that the way to handle drug addiction is to punish people. Just keep punishing them. Lock them up. Make them pay. Doesn't work. Exclusively. It might work for the dealer. That's a different person. I'm not speaking about people that have large quantities of dope in their cars or maybe on campus selling stuff. I'm talking about the user and the person who may share because they buy a little bit of heroin and then they sell it to their friends so they have enough to get a fix, but they have to use that commerce so they can get high as well. I'm not talking about dealers. We'll take that whole group off. But now how about some of our, I don't want to pick on anyone, but how about some of our older attendees? Heroin addiction, is that a moral weakness or a brain disease? Disease. Did you ever think it was maybe just a moral weakness? Yes.
I think, and I brought this up a couple times, and I think finally this can be the last time I bring it up.
Well, sure.
So I wanted to mention it to like you or the sheriff. I missed one with the sheriff. I think it's a moral weakness with leadership. Did you happen to see the movie Kill the Messenger about Gary Webb?
I don't think I did, but I'll.
It was about back in the 80s with the Iran-Contra.
Yeah.
Trading missiles, guns, whatever, drugs. They got caught. This is all public record in the 80s, running it through Governor Clinton at the time's airport in Mena, Arkansas, Ollie North, 4 tons a month to finance the goings on in Nicaragua and Iran and stuff. I mean, it's completely in the open 30 years ago. The CIA was caught putting it into Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. It's an effort to raise money, correct? Was that the money-raising effort?
Well, I'm talking about putting the crack into Los Angeles. And henceforth, your Crips and your Bloods. You know, that all came out in Los Angeles City Council meetings. 90% of the heroin or the opium was coming from Afghanistan. Maybe not so much more now because we don't have quite as much involvement. So, once again, who has the ability to bring it in by the time? And I find that an incredible moral weakness on leadership. I mean, we're getting ready to put in another Clinton. And if she doesn't go to prison, she'll be President of the United States again. With all this on the public record. How bad?
Okay, except that's the supply argument. I'm talking about the user, the person who is either has. We all, and I guess the way we mix this up, in my view, is that perhaps the first time, especially for those that don't get addicted by a medical pathway, by being prescribed opiates and not understanding the very addictive high quality of that, for those that perhaps started with, and what I see when I see all my pre-sentence investigations, and I have reports, background reports on all my defendants when they come for sentencing, it's usually cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, heroin. That's usually the advancement. So if someone in that circumstance is not addicted inadvertently through a prescription, don't they, at least the first couple of times, have a choice? Yeah, we have to admit that. But if they become addicted, we know that there are certain changes in their brain chemistry, there are anatomical changes, there are other issues that change people, and then all of a sudden it isn't a choice anymore. So sometimes I think we mix these ideas together and we don't see clearly, because it could have been maybe a bad choice to begin with, but for many people, what became a bad choice becomes the inability to escape those choices later on because of the highly addictive properties that are in heroin and other synthetic opiates. But so enough about that. I'm not here to beat on the treatment community tonight. I just wanted you to say that there are issues there, but there are plenty of issues when it comes to my group, to judges, and we are late. We are late to this game, and we need to really to move up and to do a better job. Now, there's all these terminologies that are thrown around, and I talked about relapse, right? Is relapse to be expected for those in recovery? Have you talked about recovery yet? And I mean, is recovery a straight line? Does it go just like this? Okay. Is it likely that people in recovery are going to relapse? I mean, they're going to use at some point during their recovery process? It's inevitable. It's almost inevitable. I mean, anyone here ever tried to quit smoking? Good. That means you haven't started. But if you have, do you know how many times on average it takes a smoker to quit? It's between 7 and 11. That's just for cigarettes, although nicotine's a highly addictive substance. But so, is it fair for me as the judge to assume that a person that I have sentenced, say to probation and treatment, not relapse? Is it fair for me to make that assumption? Most of us do, because success for us means this. In my world, you're only successful if you abstain, abstinence. Because if you relapse, what does that mean to me? What signal have you sent me as the judge? You've disobeyed my order, haven't you? You've actually broken the law, haven't you? I mean, heroin's illegal. If you tell me you've relapsed by using heroin, you've admitted to me you've committed no less than a felony of the 5th degree while you're being punished by me. Perhaps you're on probation. It could be a lot of things. You could be awaiting trial. We don't like that because it tells me you're unwilling and you won't follow the rules. And I can't change the rules for you because I have a whole host of other people out there who have to obey the same rules. And if they see me making exceptions for you, they're going to feel that exceptions should be made for them. So when we look at these areas, and I'm speaking historically about judges, we are looking at requirements that really aren't really realistic in the modern world as we move into the 2010s, 11, 12s, 15s, and the like. We don't like failure. We don't really know that much about addiction, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We're now learning and finding out that when we have people who are addicted and come before the court, that if we dig below the surface a little bit, we're going to find out a lot about problems that they've had in their life, problems that most of us in this room will never encounter, fortunately, and can't even really understand and comprehend. I had someone today, I can't go into details because you could look it up and find out that she was there, so I'm not going to use any names, but the trauma that she has been through as an adolescent child, incredible. We're trying to figure out what are the best treatment practices and incorporate those in what we do, and the law doesn't really tolerate multiple chances. We're not set up, we're not built for that. That's not the way that we are set up in the historical approach toward criminal justice. So let's see, can we go back, Mike? Because I want to get to a point, I don't want to overtake my time, and I really want to hopefully answer questions that you might have. All right? Let's talk about this one. On average, what percentage of when we average about 300 indictments a year. It's not a lot of criminal cases, but it's certainly enough to keep us busy. Judge Niemeyer and I split that docket, so it's about 150 plus a year. Now notice my question, drug or alcohol related or drug and alcohol charges? Does everyone know the distinction or what I'm talking about when I talk about those two things? The drug charge would be someone who is actually charged with possession of drugs, trafficking in drugs, maybe transporting drugs into a prison. I had 2 cases of that last week, or a jail. Someone who writes a forged script, but isn't it, Mike, it's almost impossible now because aren't most scripts electronically transmitted these days?
Well, I wouldn't say most, but certainly we keep a record, electronic record that's shared among
Okay.
prescribers and pharmacists.
It's much more difficult. In the old days, there was actually a pad the doctor would fill out. People would go in, divert the secretary, steal the pad, and go write scripts. We don't see that much anymore, but anything like that. That figure, just that figure, which is 1/2 up there, is actually the answer is C. It's about 45%. But I asked you to combine that with what we might call drug and alcohol related charges. So if we're going to talk about a drug and alcohol related charge, what do you think I'm speaking of? What did you interpret that to mean? Somebody, was that you, Pressure? Yeah. Go ahead.
I said theft.
Theft. What do you mean theft? How is theft related to drug usage?
Get money to buy.
Oh, steal something from somebody, maybe fence it, get the cash, and buy some drugs. That's true. What other kinds of offenses might be related? Yes, OVI fits in this category. And I see OVI offenders when they've committed multiple offenses. You have to hit the big time to get to common pleas court. You have to have 4 offenses in a 6-year period. Do we have them? It's still a crime, and less than that, they'd go to muni court. But there's another related category. For example, a common refrain. Somebody comes in. They're at their grandparents' home. A lot of grandparents. They find grandma's checkbook. They steal a check. They write a check. They forge a check. They get the money. They steal grandma's credit card. Unfortunately, it's always grandma. And grandmas always come in and they're crying, but they always want me to not punish their grandchildren, which is a whole other topic about enabling. But so if we add all of those together, the answer is E. 85% of my docket are either directly drug and alcohol charges or drug and alcohol related charges. Just a tiny fraction, 15%, are committed by people who aren't involved in that. And usually, and unfortunately, those offenses are sometimes the most serious offenses that we see. There are circumstances where you might see some violence exacted on a family member that comes from rage, not necessarily associated with alcohol or other circumstances, but about 85%. So with that being the case now, and that's going up, I wish I had a chart. I never kept a chart over the 16 years, but I wish I had, as to how these nature of these charges have increased, because they have increased substantially since I've been there the last 17 years in terms of, and especially the direct drug and alcohol charges. With that being said, what kind of policies should I be enacting as a judge when it comes to figuring out what to do with offenders who I have to punish? All of you, some of you are going to be, someone has the chance in this room of having my job in a few years, so what would you do? Should I just keep working the old route? Should it be punish and incarcerate? Should I get them off the streets? Should I deter them by removing them from society? If I remove them from society and punish them by incarcerating them, have I put a dent, you think, in this problem that we're talking about? Well, that's always a risk when you sentence somebody, if you're a judge, that if you don't sentence to jail and they do something bad, someone's going to come back and write an article about you. But that's, that comes with the territory. So the point you're making is that, and we haven't really talked about all the options I have yet. I was going to save that for the end to see what I can and can't do. But incarceration seems to have been the most preferred approach, at least over the last number of years, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. How about the next question, Mike? All right. So does everyone, I put this in there so you knew, I have to go to school every year. I would go anyway, but I have to go to school. Judges, regardless of what the local newspaper says, we do get education every once in a while, Allison. So many people don't believe, but it is true. And I'm just teasing her. They've never accused us of not. So we have to go. Judge Niemeyer and I, we try and double this if we can, depending upon the dockets, to get a lot more hours, because the law is really dynamic and there's a lot to it. But nobody got the right answer. Nobody. I am not mandated to have any education in drug addiction. Now, don't look at me. I do go, and I go every chance I can, but I am not mandated by the Ohio Supreme Court, which is my boss, to actually have any addiction education. And you know what's even more frightening? I run a drug court, which we'll talk about in a moment. Tony? this is a bit of a trick question because I wanted to make sure you knew I wasn't mandated. And I would say, isn't that an oddity with what we've talked about with the increase in drug and alcohol cases and drug and alcohol related cases? If 85% of my docket deals with that, when I go to my education classes, I'm not actually required by law to do it. But yes, it is offered, and we do present it. I have the sort of honor of, I actually have the honor of speaking to new judges before they take the bench and after they take the bench about sentencing issues and other criminal justice issues. And I also help plan our programming for our meetings where we get these hours, and we always try and incorporate some amount of education on addiction and addiction-related issues. But if we didn't, there's nothing, there's no mechanism to sort of require or compel that we engage in that. Some might argue it might be a good idea. I don't know. Pressure?
Are there other areas that you are mandated to give education in?
Something that we refer to as fairness. And there was a time when we had to get alcohol and drug addiction education about ourselves to ensure that we, because there is a high percentage of my profession, I'm a lawyer and a judge, but there's a high percentage of drug addiction and alcoholism in the legal profession. So we used to all be required to go to 1 hour a year to hear about why we shouldn't abuse alcohol or drugs. And it was okay. We called it the testimonial hour because usually one of our colleagues would come up and tell us what happened to them. And so now we've switched it around, and now we're trying to learn about addiction to deal with the people who are in front of us. It's also insightful and helpful to any individual that goes through it. But fairness is all we have to have, and that is the idea that we have to learn and be attentive to issues. Right now, the big issue is obviously gay marriage, and some of my colleagues have gotten in trouble by declaring that they wouldn't perform gay weddings, and a couple judges wouldn't issue marriage certificates out of probate court since that's where they are. So that's where those issues come from, but not addiction. What do you think? Is that a good idea? Did I not have to have any education in addiction, and yet I can run a drug court and a docket that deals primarily with drugs and alcohol? It's okay with everybody? Anybody surprised by this?
I thought it was you'd think there would be some way to have a dynamic requirement so that if you're whatever the shift is, you know, anything that you have more than 50% of your caseload in would become a required area of education or something like that.
Well, how about to operate a drug court? Nothing. And I think it's a failing. Plus, I teach new judges, and I get to speak to them before they take the bench. It seems to me to be a very fertile place to start to see if we can start to change judicial attitudes from what we've talked about, from moving from a strict punishment regime to a regime that's more nuanced and where you can put into motion a lot of these different purposes and principles of sentencing, but nonetheless. All right. And no, oh, please don't. But actually, there's nothing they can do. It only comes. The Supreme Court is our operating group, so it'd have to be the Chief Justice, and she's well aware of it. I'm not sure why she hasn't pushed this, but I can assure you though that we do incorporate. For example, we have a 3-hour program in December on trauma-informed care and its relationship to addiction. Next summer, we have a program on MAT coming. So we do put it in there, but it's odd that it's really not mandated. And if a judge didn't want to go or attend, as long as he or she got his hours somewhere else, they could avoid this if they were philosophically opposed to the notion that we've talked about. All right. What's the next one I have out, Mike? Oh, okay, here we go. Now, this is a little bit of my editorial comment that's put in there, and I'm speaking only for myself tonight. So, Allison, don't attribute this to Judge Niemeyer. He wouldn't appreciate that. But 53% of you, the most of everyone, about a little bit more than half, thought it was 425%. It's actually above 775. It's nearly 800%. It's nearly 800%. Okay, so what have we gotten for our efforts to incarcerate more people per capita in the world than any other country? And we've accomplished that. What have we gotten for our efforts? Smarter criminals. There's certainly something to be said for that, for putting especially drug mules and people who aren't at the higher echelons of the drug trade in for long periods of time, and that was really the federal approach. We followed it a bit in Ohio, but our approach was never in Ohio, never as draconian as the federal system has been. And now there's an effort, and it has an interesting amalgamation of interests. We have some of the most liberal Democrats and some of the most conservative Republicans have come together and have a bill that's working its way through the Senate Judiciary Committee as we speak that's going to change some of this. It's sort of a strange bedfellows, isn't it, to have the most liberal of the liberal and the most conservative of the conservative coming together on this issue? How do you think that's possible? What's the common thread, do you think? Money, yeah. At least on the conservative side, it's money. On the other side, there are other issues that are involved, especially when you look to see who has been incarcerated and what races and what rates. It's a frightening snapshot. I didn't bring that with me tonight, but it is a frightening snapshot. How about, I think it's my last one. All right, so for all of what that we have spent in money, and I have a little diagram to show a little bit to show this, and we've spent a lot of money, plus we've incarcerated millions of people over the last 40 years. Actually, the answer is it's remained about the same. Because when you average all addictions out, it's remained effectively about the same. I see Prescia giving me that look, but it's essentially the U.S. addiction rate. When you combine most addictive drugs together, the addiction rate has remained relatively constant over the course of the last 40 years. And I think I have a... Oh, wait, no, it's on my... Yeah, if we could. I want to go buy this one and come back then if I can. I'll come back here. All right. The bottom is the essential rate of addiction to opiates. And now this chart only goes to 2010. It has gone up since then, substantially. And there's the money that you've spent on the war on drugs from 1970 to 2010, and that's your rate of addiction. Has it worked? I don't know how you can argue that it has. I guess you could. I guess the argument that I hear is that, well, if we didn't spend that much money, the rate of addiction would be higher. It's kind of hard to argue against that, because how would anybody know? But the war on drugs, as it is portrayed, which is a punitive approach, mandatory sentences, high sentences, large sentences, incarceration for all levels of participants, drug mules, drug dealers, drug kingpins. And by the way, most drug kingpins have never, ever been incarcerated. It's almost always the lower echelons of folks who get wrapped up in this and get sentenced. So we have that issue. I wanted to go back. So there have been, and so I've tried to paint purposefully sort of a bleak picture, so I can now tell you that there are changes. It's not as bleak as I've talked about. In the last number of years, at least in Ohio, and it's true in most other states, what has emerged is something called a specialty docket. And a specialty docket means that a particular issue is pulled off the regular docket, put into a special program, and dealt with differently. So we have such a specialty docket in Findlay. We have a drug court. You may have heard of this. There are veterans courts that take veterans off the regular criminal docket and handle their issues specially. There's some courts that take the multiple OVI, drunk driver offender, pull him or her off of the regular docket and deal with them in an intensified fashion. Let's see, what other specialty dockets are there? They're vets. Women. There's actually a specialty docket in Dayton for women that deal with human trafficking issues. So there are these sorts of specialty dockets where these particular type of cases are pulled off and moved into a different docket and a different approach. Has anyone here ever been to or seen on television a drug court, operating drug court? Okay, I think Allison and Tony have been to mine, or Judge Niemeyer's, you've been to one? Here or somewhere? Chicago. What did you think of it?
It was definitely interesting. I did an internship for a long time in high school.
Okay. What was, well, when you say strange, it was certainly different from regular court, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, you have like the cop that was on there giving his testimony about what's that happened. And then it's kind of like the young cop going around giving his testimony.
Boy, that would be a strange drug court, because that's not the way we operate ours in Ohio, so it must have been something unique. Has everyone or anyone here not heard of the drug court or drug courts that are being operated across the state of the country? Is this a new phrase to anybody? Everyone, you've not heard about it? For those of you who've heard about it, what do you think it is? Uh-oh. Now, doctor, they're in your class and they've heard about drug court and they've not actually done any independent research?
We have not done the independent research.
Okay.
For sure.
Anyone here heard about it, read about it, seen it on TV? Okay. Do you want to know what's involved? Okay. Because this is the newer approach. This is taking drug cases, and in our situation, as I mentioned, the other courts, veterans have special problems, and other groups that have been able to demonstrate that they have special problems that, if dealt with appropriately, could be addressed. And we could reduce recidivism, which is a term for meaning recommitting offenses. We can end addiction, hopefully, and get people sober, whatever the case may be. In the Dayton court, where it's involving women in human trafficking, getting young girls out of that sort of life and getting them back into a stable environment, whatever the topic may be. The drug court's the most popular of those, and because it's the largest national problem, I think, that we have in that regard. So here's what we do. If you're going to have a drug court, you have to agree or accept the proposition, for it to really work, that there is a medical model to addiction, something that we have talked about. That in fact, if you repeatedly use opiates, for example, it's not true that everyone who uses opiates gets addicted. That's a myth. That is not true. There is a genetic, in my view, and I know, doctor, if you disagree, a genetic predisposition for some people to make them far more likely to become addicted, because a lot of people take pain meds and some don't like them, some have reactions, and for some they do nothing, and for some they alleviate the pain, and once it's over, they're not addicted. But there is a percentage of our population, and I think it's about 2.5% now. Yeah, there's some small, and what's interesting when you try and study this area, the amount of and competing statistics you receive on any of these topics, it's almost impossible to sort out. So I do my best, because I don't want to say something which isn't true, but there is a certain percentage of us who have predispositions, genetic and otherwise. Alcoholics, there's a certain percentage of alcoholics who have a predisposition, a physiological predisposition, and so we're finding out so much about the brain now. So if you're going to have a drug court, you have to agree and accept that this is, at some point, where we talked about the initial choices that people make, and then all of a sudden addiction rolls in and they have a change in brain physiology and they become addicted that way, so it's no longer a choice, that literally these commands, these urges take over every possible thinking process they had, and their entire lives are focused on obtaining, in most cases, heroin now, because prescription opiates are difficult to come by because we've choked off the supply, most large supplies for people to get to. So now they've gone to heroin, which is actually now cheaper. It has a lot of problems because of its purity questions, and sometimes it's laced with fentanyl and other drugs and creates a lethal mixture. But nonetheless, you have to agree to accept the medical model of addiction. And if you do that and enter a drug court, then all of a sudden we're not talking about moral weaknesses or moral failings anymore. Right? And we're not talking about people making choices, and if they make the wrong choice, having to be absolutely punished by the criminal justice system, as it were, for each act they commit. It provides me with a little space, as I like to say, when I'm trying to handle cases. We employ what are called evidence-based approaches. There is an incredible amount of evidence now that's been garnered by people who study what I do to see what works. Some things work and some things don't. Some approaches work and some approaches do work. If you have a drug court or a specialty court, you have to apply those approaches which have actually been shown to work, not what you think you want to do and not what you believe to be the best approach. So if there are many judges out there who are colleagues of mine who don't believe that addiction is a medical problem, they believe it's a moral weakness problem, and they are unwilling to use evidence-based practices. They believe everyone who uses drugs should go to prison, no exceptions. Okay. In Ohio, we are elected by the people of our county, so if that's what they want, they can continue to do that if they wish, and you're still going to have the same results we've talked about, but they can't have a drug court because there isn't any reason that they would be running totally, those theories and philosophies would be running totally counter to one another. Now, the one thing the drug court does, which I found has been actually liberating as a judge, is it provides an incredible amount of opportunity for exercising and utilizing creativity. I can fashion sentences or sanctions, as we call them. We don't even call them punishments anymore. We call them sanctions, if need be, in certain situations which might be out of the ordinary, which wouldn't just be you're going to jail, you're going to prison. There could be a lot of things that we might want to do. It could be in the form of some treatment program we might have selected for them, but a lot of things that we can do. And now, this is something that drives the old school absolutely crazy. The use of incentives and punishments to deal with offenders' conduct. Have any of you ever just gone to court to observe? Is that anyone here? Just a couple folks? I know Allison's been there many times. Tony's been there a long time. Any of you just gone? Pressure has gone. But how about the students? Anyone gone? I would offer you this invitation. They should come to drug court sometime and watch it. They would be more than welcome. We have it every Tuesday afternoon. Judge Niemeyer's on one Tuesday. I'm on another. We start at 2 o'clock and we go to about 3 o'clock. We have a staffing beforehand, but that's a private affair and it's not open to the public. But I would welcome you to come and watch drug court if you haven't watched it, because it's kind of tough to explain the contrast that you would see between the two approaches, the general old school, old-fashioned punitive approach where I wag my finger at you and tell you do not do that again, versus what we try and accomplish in drug court. Because in drug court, I wag my finger, but I'm also literally handing out, I gave a subway card out the other day to someone who had done really well. I give people compliments if they've done well. I probably know as much about their families now than they know about their families, because we have a lot of research that we do on people. So I'm in some ways a parental substitute, and I don't say that dismissively. I think that's what some of these kids are missing. So we actually change, and as I mentioned, it allows me to step out of my traditional role as a judge, as just a punisher, to not only being a punisher, but being a rewarder at the same time when appropriate. That doesn't mean you get to come in and if you screwed up for a week, I just don't come in and say, that's not good, you got to do better. No, we punish people. Judge Niemeyer took somebody out in chains Tuesday in drug court because they had tested, I think it was their second time for testing positive. Tony, was it something he didn't want to do, but he couldn't, in the face of everyone else, just stand there and do nothing. But by the same token, we do things. We've been helpful to people. We've aligned them with resources. We try every conceivable approach, because one thing I think is true, we have some parents here, right? Any parents here? All right. When you are trying to work with your children, is all you do is punish them? Do we ever give them any adulation, any positive feedback? We don't? You folks, come on. Okay, so how is it that, and does it work to punish when necessary, but to also reward when appropriate? So why wouldn't it work in my world? I mean, think of if all people that appear in front of me do is they hear the negative from me. If that's all they hear, I mean, am I really motivating them to really do anything? I guess I can scare them maybe. But as I mentioned, remember those first two assumptions? What are the two assumptions that I operate under? If something's made a crime, that no one's going to break the law, we know that's not true. And worse yet, when we punish them for it, we assume they won't do it again. We know that's not true. So if all we do is punish, that's been proven not to work in and of itself. And that doesn't mean, though, that we walk in and this isn't like The Price is Right, where everyone gets to pick out something they want. I mean, it isn't that way. These things are measured, they're reviewed, they're discussed. For example, I have a gentleman who just a few short months ago was laying near death. EMTs got there, gave him, I think, is Narcan Narcan is the proprietary term. Narcan, which is a substance which will reverse the effects of an overdose. I mean, he was seconds away from dying. Seconds away. The EMTs got there, they shot the Narcan in his nose. It reversed the effect. He survived. I punished him. He's been doing well for 6 months. You know what all he wanted me to let him do? Was go to a football game to watch his son play. So I let him go. Because we have curfews on these people. So those are the sorts of things. So it doesn't have to be money. It could be anything, any extension of trust to people. And we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and drug courts aren't perfect, but drug courts, I mean, the evidence is clear. They do work, and they do reduce recidivism, and they do something else, and that is we keep people out of prisons, which is a good thing. So that's what we are doing here locally. It's not an approach which has caught on nation or statewide. We have 735 sitting judges from all jurisdictions. We have less than 100 that are involved in some kind of specialty docket. So it will probably catch on. It will work. Some judges are afraid of it. They're afraid of it for what I mentioned before because of their philosophical approach, the teaching, the traditional way of handling things. They're also fearful, I think, of getting, and I mean this in a figurative sense, taking the robe off in their traditional role and actually dealing with people. It is a little disconcerting for all these years if that's what you've done, to literally step off the bench and shake somebody's hand. It sounds kind of foolhardy, doesn't it? Like, wouldn't want to do that, but it goes against everything that we sort of teach about how justice works and what the role of a judge is and how a judge is supposed to act and how a judge acts will actually affect behavior. Now, I don't want you to think that the traditional general punitive approach doesn't work. It works in some circumstances. I have people that come back and see me every so often and say, thank you for what you did, you got my attention. But we're talking about generalizing over the course of a number of years, and over a number of years, it's not an approach that is working well, especially when we're dealing with drug cases. Because the notion of acting rationally while you're high is something that really doesn't mesh very well together, and decision-making can be really poor under those circumstances. I hope I have time for questions. Is that...
We'll be till almost 8 o'clock.
See, because I don't want to go on forever, but I can. But I would prefer not to go on forever. But I would be most interested in finding out, first of all, for all those that are here, have I made, well, this may be a loaded question, have I made sense? That may be too strong of a word, but do you have questions about what I've talked about? Because I want to make sure that I'm communicating directly, then answer any questions you have about the criminal justice system. Yes?
Okay, my question is that I understand what you're doing, but then I look at the broader picture of the state of Ohio. How do you get to be a drug court, and are there certain procedures you have to go through to allow yourself to step away from the traditional court? I mean, does Franklin County, Lucas County follow the same procedures, or does each drug court sort of do their own thing?
Well, that's a really, really good question, and there's about 3 separate answers. I'll see if I can get them all to you. First of all, I'll take the easiest one first. There are certain protocols that you have to follow to apply, and you have to apply to the Supreme Court for certification. And we actually, this isn't, Allison, you can't write this down. You have to promise me you're not going to write this next sentence down. Seriously. All right, promise me. All right, because this is off the record. We started before we got pre-certified, so we kind of jumped the gun a little bit. Okay, you can put back on now. But anyway, we received what was called pre-certification relatively quickly, and I've got to give a shout out to our court administrator, Kim Schweitzer, who has done really almost all the work. Judge Niemeyer and I have not done the preparatory work. She's done it all. But we wanted to do it, but she's been helpful, and she's very knowledgeable, been involved in state activities for probation departments and all these things, and she is our court administrator and chief probation officer. So she got us through pre-certification. We just had visits from the Supreme Court staff 2 weeks running, and they were very happy with the program, and they've granted us full certification. We'll be fully certified in December. Now, what certification does, it says a couple things. First of all, it says that you are following the best practices models that I had up there, and there are certain best practices models. But most importantly, what it says is that we see that while the judge, may have the right attitude, there has to be this linchpin, and that is there has to be a treatment program that's attached to it. Because that's what gets people sober, is the right kind of treatment, the appropriate level of care depending upon where they are. And by that I mean, does it mean going to AA? Yes. Does it mean going to group? Yes. Does it mean going to a treatment facility? Perhaps. Does it mean going to a lockdown treatment facility? Maybe. Does it mean being in a recovery home? I'm going to use the word, sorry, I'm going to use the because I'm in favor of recovery homes, at the whole continuum. So we have that in place. And the reason we didn't really do this earlier, because we wanted to get started, but we didn't have that piece in place. So we were unwilling to start our drug court unless we thought it was going to work. You can do it with fanfare, and judges get all these credits, but if it doesn't work, there's no sense in doing that. So we have a certification process, but as I mentioned, oddly enough, I'm not required to get any special education. We've taken upon ourselves to get as much as we possibly can to learn about this, because it's important to understand, but I find that sort of odd, right, that everyone else on the staff we have to have a treatment team, they have to be licensed. We have many people that work for some of the groups that Precious is affiliated with, and they have all the alphabet letters behind them, the LSW, all that stuff, which means good things, that they're trained. So we've met all that. In terms of certification, what it does for me is it allows me the latitude and freedom to be able to, what we call staff cases. I'm generally not permitted, let's say you have a case in my court, and let's say that you have a lawsuit against another party. I'm not permitted to talk to that other party's lawyer privately about your case unless you or your lawyer are there. We call that ex parte communications because it's not fair, and we have to follow those rules very, very carefully. When we do drug court, when we have our staffings, I don't have the defendant there. We let his lawyer come if he wants, and if he shows up, fine, but he doesn't get to, I mean, we're making the decision. So we have a lot of ex parte communications about our offenders, and the Supreme Court, by getting certified, lets us out of that rule so we can have more involvement in what's going on in people's lives and be more heavily involved and be able to engage in these sort of other approaches with the support of the Supreme Court, and that's the important thing. But yeah, there is the formal, and then there's the informal. What's the best course of treatment? Now, nobody agrees in every way how treatment should work, and nobody agrees on every judicial response in those circumstances. We're never going to get that, but
So, I mean, and this is a loaded kind of question, and you have this drug court, some other county does not. Is this fair to the person that's been caught committing a crime to be given an opportunity over here, since we're supposedly a sequel country, to not really have to serve the sentence in jail, et cetera, versus somebody who doesn't have this opportunity? And I don't know which counties have opportunities or not. I assume the bigger cities do.
yeah, drug courts started really in larger metropolitan areas where the problems were far more pervasive, and that's really not entirely, but yes, you are right. That's where they really got their genesis or beginning, and we actually called in 2000. We called the Supreme Court and asked if they would consider allowing us to be a drug court, and our numbers were so small back then, they said, no, we would never consider letting you. Unfortunately, the sign of the times and the increase in my docket have taken us to a point where we qualify. That's unfortunate. It's sad on one side, but it's good on the other side since we're able to approach it. Is it fair? It isn't. No, it isn't fair. But to be honest with you, because judges can vary so differently in how they approach cases, and because they're elected in each of the counties, and they're elected, they're not appointed, that you're still going to see sentencing disparities or differences regionally and county by county. So would I like to see that there be a drug court that everyone in Ohio who is qualified could be in? Yes, I would. But and by the way, we don't let everyone in who wants into drug court. You talked about protocols. That was the third leg of the stool I wanted you to know. We have criteria. They have to actually meet, have a drug alcohol dependence diagnosis from a professional, because people can try and get in who really don't have problems, and they try and evade the system. So no, we screen them as well as everything else. But it's a very good question. And we've been at it officially since March, unofficially a little bit earlier than that, and which too early. People ask me, are we successful? I had the word success up there, and I wanted to ask everyone, what does success mean in the drug addiction field? Someone who's addicted to be successful, what's your definition? Pardon me? Decrease the use. That presupposes maybe still some use. Decrease the number of relapses, not end them entirely. How can someone be successful who's a drug addict if they're still using? And I'm sort of teasing both of you. I'm trying to press you because you're right. When you're in drug court, success means something a little bit different than it may mean in a regular court docket with a judge who has a different philosophy. There is no definition, so each is correct in how he or she may approach their case and make a decision. It's the later social consequences where we find that it might be best to approach it differently. But success in drug court doesn't mean perfection. And that's hard. It's a hard pill to swallow. No pun intended, Mike, for that one. But I didn't even think about that before I said it. But it's difficult for some people to accept the notion that people, and I'm talking about people who are on supervision to me. And maybe I forgot to mention that as part of punishment, I don't have to send everyone to prison. I can put people on what we call probation or supervision. And if I do that, they may stay in the community. They may do some local jail time. They may go to a treatment place. They may go to a halfway house. But ultimately, they come out and they have to be reintegrated in our community. And that's when we see most of these issues arise, that people relapse. They may be going to treatment, but they relapse. They may violate something else. Maybe they were trying to get drugs and couldn't, but we learned things that they had done. Maybe they had stolen something from a family member. Sometimes when we don't see people for a couple of days, they call in and say, my kid's sick. I mean, it's almost like the school truancy officer. We get every excuse known to man. I'm sure, Mike, you've had a few, right, from your students who have been sick and the like. We get a lot of that, and then we know what's going on. When they don't show up, we know there's probably been some usage over the weekend, and they're trying to stay away from having to drop urine as long as they can to see if they can work it out of their system. So, but yes, success means something different in this new world of criminal justice opposed to the old world of criminal justice. In the old days, in some judges, you test positive once while on probation. If you were let out of prison and on probation, you're going back. If you never went in the first place, you're going to go. Mike.
How much latitude do you have for some criminality that might be related to the drug use? Prostitution or grand larceny or assault? That's all part of their disease. Mm-hmm. But how much latitude do you have for those other things that are not just drug use?
You mean if they want to get into drug court, or just in the regular, if they're not in drug court but just come before me as a defendant in a court case?
Well, let's say that if you're considering taking someone into drug court,
okay,
but if they have some of these other fearsome indictments.
Okay. You're asking how I handle it? I look at it, I try my best to look at it holistically. I look at the whole package of offenses. The first thing I do, and this may sound simplistic, but this is how I work in my world. I divide the world of criminal defendants in two classes. The people that I'm fearful of and you should be fearful of, and the people that I'm mad at because they won't do what I tell them to do. So that's the first thing I do. So if this defendant you're speaking of fits into the person I'm mad at, they haven't committed a assaultive crime, they haven't committed a vehicular assault or vehicular homicide with the use of alcohol and or drugs, they have committed a series of, say, thefts, and I have to separate those out between robberies and burglaries, because some people on drugs will rob, and that's different. This is where I just draw my world. If you pull a gun on somebody or hit somebody over the head with a stick and take what they have, even though you have a drug habit, I'm sorry, you've left one sphere and you've gone to another, and I'm not willing to help you now. Maybe later I will be, but I'm not willing to help you now. But if it's a nonviolent offense, essentially, but it's drug-related, I will take them all and consider those all, and that person, as long as we can find the genesis or the source of the problem, and if it's alcohol and drug-related, and it's serious enough to get a DSM, where are we, 5, 4, where are we these days? 5 diagnosis, they can be in drug court. Sometimes people don't qualify, so I would have that same drug-dependent person, and I would have them on the regular docket, and I'm still permitted to consider not sending them to prison as long as I can be assured that we can deal with their issues through what we call straight or regular probation. So we really have what we call local sanctions of 2 different spheres, drug court and then regular probation as well, and then we can handle it. But yeah, because many of those, as I said, most of those offenses I see, you can get the root of the problem pretty easily and figure out where they are. But that's how I divide up the world: the people that we should be afraid of and the people that we should just be mad at. And a lot of judges will send people to prison just because they're mad at them, because they won't show up, or they violate curfew, or they test dirty a couple times. And these aren't behaviors that I condone. There are ways to handle them without sending them to prison necessarily. And again, these are my views. There could be a judge in the next adjoining county who, and I don't know if there is or not, who may feel entirely different than I do about how to approach those issues. But by the way, you only gave me 5 questions. I was going to put up a 7th question. What is the current population of Ohio's prisons? How many people do you think are in Ohio's prisons today? Is it that high? It's somewhere, it vacillates every day, but it's somewhere between 51 and 53, generally speaking, 1,000 people in Ohio. That's in Ohio's prisons. That's not in Ohio's jails and treatment facilities. Now, the second question is, what's our bed capacity in Ohio's prisons? What's our actual bed capacity? 38. So in our state right now, we have about 51 to 52 to 53,000, because it literally changes every day as people come in and people go out, and we really only have capacity for 38,000 of them. So we have perpetual overcrowding. Yes?
That's where your committee would be wrestling with the only have 38,000 beds, but
Not only does it sway my opinion, the legislature keeps changing the law and making it more difficult for me structurally to do that. And another little secret, but Allison can write this down if she wants, and that is that we receive a lot of grant money from the state to operate our programs, because we have a lot of really good probation, intensive probation programs. We really try and put resources, intense resources, to help people. And one of the things that determines whether you receive that money or not is how many people do you send to Ohio's prisons every year. And a high prison population has an impact that no one even thinks about, and that is when you have that many people in prison, and we do have one of the best systems in the country in terms of different treatment programs that are actually available in prison. We're top shelf when it comes to that, and that's in large measure due to our director Gary Moore, who's come in, and he's committed. He actually made a commitment and told the governor that when he came in, if you wanted me to be director of Ohio's prisons, we're not building anymore. And he's literally put his foot down. He's not going to. He doesn't want any more. So the only thing that we can do is we have to go the other direction and do something with the population that we have. But when you have that many people in prison, what it means is if you want to get into a treatment program while you're there, it takes all that much longer. I mean, the waits are months. Some people serve their sentence before they get in any programs, even though they've applied and they want to get in. So having overcrowding creates a lot of problems, one of which is it clogs up the system and it prohibits people from getting into treatment programs while they're there. And we've had some efforts in recent years in an attempt to reduce the populations. They were just ill-conceived and wrong-headed, but some people get the governor's ear and other people don't get the governor's ear. And so we'll see, maybe this next go-around we can actually, and by that I mean the last time we did a major shift, the governor didn't want to listen to the judges. He decided he'd listen to another group, and guess what happened? He passed this major legislation in 2011 that was going to reduce, 7,000, 6,000? It actually added 1,000. But go ahead, you had a question? That's just my editorial, by the way. You can cut that out if you want. So.
logistically, what do you do with that below 50,000 surface?
What do I do? What
Is the system?
they find places such as gymnasiums, extra rooms. They bunk people in rooms and cells that are built for 2 or 3. They put 5 or 6. They take single cells and put 2 people in single cells. They have to find the space. I mean, think if you operate, what's interesting about our system, think if you were operating a hotel and you had 100 beds, but under the system you had to take everyone that showed up. What would you do? If you had a meeting room, for example, or banquet room, guess what? No more banquets. If you had a room with 2 beds, you might put in 3, and you might get to spend the night with a stranger. Of course, I guess that's happening now. What's that European app or whatever? You get an app now where you can sleep on somebody's. I guess we ought to be doing that in Ohio, but that's what happens, and it creates all sorts of other problems. It creates a lot of other problems. Ask prison guards or prison administrators what kind of problems this overcrowding creates. And, and if, again, I don't want to sound like I'm some total bleeding heart, but if you put people in intolerable conditions and let them out, what do people come out as if they? But we're working on that, and one way to do it is to let people out early. That's one way. Another way is to turn the tap off so we don't send as many people there, so as they cycle out we can get the population down. So that's what we're all trying to do from our end, and that's one thing that drug court can help do, and that is not send so many people there in the first place. But yes?
I know this is kind of this might be a loaded question a little bit, a lot that might get into this, but what are the criteria for getting people out or removing them early from the kind of thing?
That's also a good question. It can come from a variety of sources. First of all, the governor has absolute pardon power. He can pardon anybody he wants and let them out. That happens very infrequently, usually at the end of the last term, but it does happen. But we're talking less than 30 or 40 people. If people are on, and this gets slightly complicated because we're still operating with 2 systems. We changed the sentencing law in the 90s from what were called indefinite sentences. In the late 90s, if I sent you to prison, I would send you to prison for a minimum of 2 to a maximum of 15 years, for example, in one category. Once you did your 2, the parole board would decide if you got out. Now we've changed that, and now you get what's called a definite sentence. You get 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 7 years, or the like. You get a flat, there's no tail on the end of it. And for a majority of those people, they can petition me before they complete their sentence to let them out on what we call judicial release. They can also engage in programming, and if successful, gain early release or credit, what they call good time credit. And so there are mechanisms built into the system to let a certain percentage of offenders out early, but it takes judicial approval. Now, if you have a judge who I mentioned before, and again, I'm not trying to be terribly harsh on my colleagues, but if you have a judge who believes in the punitive approach, is he or she likely to agree to release someone before the end of their sentence? It's not used or accepted very often, what we call judicial release, judge release from prison. So it really takes the judge to a great degree at the front end and at the back end to be part of the system to create a potential early release. So I had a judicial release today, as a matter of fact. I let a young lady out of prison who was in prison, sent her to a rehab center. Drug addiction was her problem. 4 cases, four separate cases. So, but I didn't let her out. I sent her to a rehab center, so we'll see how she does for the next several months and see if she makes it when she gets out. So, again, those are principally the ways. But when we changed our laws in 1996, it was a huge sea change. Your legislature decided for all of us that it was going to get tough. And if you were sentenced to 8 years, by golly, you were going to do 8 years. None of this get credit and get out the back door and nobody knows about it. We called it truth in sentencing, and that's when the population just went like this, because there really wasn't those mechanisms that you'd mentioned before. As a matter of fact, there was an article in the Columbus Dispatch 2 days ago for those people who were subject to release by the parole board. The parole board is now releasing maybe 30 people a year maximum. So those people aren't getting out anytime soon. It's a really complicated complicated system. My rule book used to be one volume. It's now four volumes. So everyone's an expert when it comes to criminal justice. Everybody's an expert.
If issue 3 were to pass on November 3rd, would that make your job more difficult or less difficult?
That's an interesting question because I have my own views, which I will not share on issue 3 because I'm still a judge, and the impact of issue 3, if it passes, I don't want people to think that I'm prejudging any case. It will probably do a little bit of both. It will simplify my docket to some degree, although we have very few marijuana cases. We used to see quite a few. You don't see them anymore. At least I don't see them anymore. Or I shouldn't say anymore. I see very few marijuana cases, and if I do, it's usually trafficking in marijuana. You just don't see that many possession cases. Not like the old days, and unfortunately, I think it's because we're, from at least the research that I see, that we see of folks moving over to other things, which is not a good idea. And we're in a state that makes marijuana illegal right now, so we can't say it was because we've legalized the drug that people have moved. But there's a whole host of views on that. So that would make my job slightly easier because my docket would be reduced by a few number of cases. Where it's going to make our job more difficult, and it's probably going to move over to my colleagues in municipal court. Because I haven't had a chance to actually study the Colorado data. I know there's been a lot of stuff that's been issued by both sides, and I'm a very cynical person. I have to actually read and research the data myself before I'm going to make a decision. That's sort of what I do for a living. So the propaganda I don't listen to. But I have a concern that maybe my municipal court colleagues could see a few more drugged driving cases than they have on their docket now. Most OVIs, which are operating cars under the influence, almost all of them are alcohol related. It's about 90-some%. I saw some figure that it may have increased in Colorado with their new law. Okay, show me the data and then I'll take a look at it. So I could see, Doctor, there'd be an increase on that end over there, but probably not on my end. One area that's going to have to be sorted out that Colorado had that would be in the employment law area, and that is if somebody tested positive on a drug screen at their employment, but marijuana was legal in their state, if the drug test result showed a residue in their system but not a sufficient level of psychoactive substance to affect their driving and the like. So the question would be, could they be fired? And Colorado's already answered that question. The Colorado Supreme Court already said that an employer can have a policy prohibiting marijuana use because it's still illegal under federal law. So they may have gone against the policy of the state of Colorado, but because it's still a federal offense, that an employer could have a zero tolerance policy with respect to marijuana in a state that has it as legal. So you might see something there, but I haven't really thought it through to see where else I might see the problems, because we've kind of almost, probably everyone knows, we had a sea change back in the 70s, and we made the possession of less than 100 grams of marijuana a minor misdemeanor offense. So if you have more than that, it can be a misdemeanor, and then it graduates to a felony at some level. But that's something that many states didn't follow. So we've had that in effect since the 70s. If you have a couple of joints in your pocket, you're walking down the street, the officer writes you a traffic citation in effect. So we don't see high levels I don't see high levels of marijuana trafficking. I mean, bales and that sorts of thing. Every once in a while we may get something off the highway, which is where someone's transporting from one state to another, not generally bound for something here, but I've not studied it close enough to see. Well, and we'll have to see how it works with issue 2, and that's going to be interesting too if we have a conflict. That'll be the more interesting legal battle, because they're already setting those up as to competing constitutional amendments and how they work. If you had a situation where 2 and 3 both passed, that's going to be, as a legal spectator, that's going to be fun to watch as a judge. It won't mean anything to anyone here, but it will be fun from an internal legal standpoint to listen to their arguments. Will be interesting. But do you see anything? I mean, from your position, do you see legal issues?
Long-term, potentially, in that making it recreational use legal seems to give an approval to use illicit drugs that then may quite likely lead to greater involvement with some other drugs. And so further down the pike, I'm very concerned about recreational use.
Okay. One thing we don't know, though, and no one talks about, we don't know the baseline right now in Ohio, correct? Or do we? I mean, marijuana is illegal, but a lot of people are using it right now. So the question is, we need to know the baseline and then sort of extrapolate, do we not, to figure out what would be increased from the baseline?
Yes, but I think there are some national statistics out there that suggest from the Michigan survey of drug use by state, I think we've got a fairly reliable background level.
I know the Lancet did a study on states with medical marijuana, the British Journal, and they said there's no adolescent increase, no appreciable adolescent increase in marijuana usage with states that have medical marijuana. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but they have a study. But that's not for states like Colorado as of yet, and is it Washington or Oregon? So yes, we're going to have to we have to see. We may be in an experiment next year. Now, the question will become, I've always been fascinated by the gateway argument, because in my experience, and I get to read a lot of reports about people's lifelong drug usage, I see tobacco and alcohol preceding marijuana, but those two are legal. So that's what I not totally. That's what I see. Plus, I see the insipid increase in opiate usage isn't coming from illicit drug usage. It's coming from prescriptions. So the new gateway is that way, which is outside there. It's a lot of questions. I don't have an answer to any of them, but we'll have to wait and see. Part of me says, you know what? I'd love to take this area and move it off the table and concentrate just on opiate addiction and these other issues, but it isn't that big a portion of the docket here. I don't know how it is in other parts of the state. Perhaps it's a greater issue, but here it just doesn't come to us. Now, maybe it goes to muni court with the possession cases, but certainly a lot to think about. And I don't know, and we'll know Colorado's been in this experiment for almost 2 years. So hopefully some more data will come out of Colorado, concerned about what you mentioned, because one of the reasons we make laws and have things that are illegal is because we want to set a bar of conduct, right? And so when we remove that bar, as you mentioned, it may give a sort of an approval to people who may have been on the fence about what to do. And so, yeah, I worry about that too, as well. But, yes?
I have 3 questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Well, you're assuming I have a good enough memory to take care of all of them. But.
Well, the first, I just wondered who's going to preside over the next drug court. Who's up next?
You mean in our community, or you mean, are you?
Who was up yesterday? Who's up next?
Oh, I see. It's me. Is next Tuesday the 20? Wait, no, the 27th? That's me.
Okay. The other one, going back to something you said earlier, I don't know what the practicality of this would be or what the cost would be. But like I saw something that Sheriff Heldman commented on about how many addicts he has in his jail at the moment. And there was like an unfortunate thing where somebody had OD'd something like an injection into the heart or something like that.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh.
So I just wondered what the practicality would be before someone starts their incarceration period, getting cleaned out first.
Pressure, you want to take that? we should.
We have just, as of October, started an ambulatory detox. It's just in pilot phase. We are working closely with the hospital to try and see if there's a possibility for us to be able to get a detox program. But the truth is that the vast majority of detox happens at our local jail. So, you know, we've spent a lot of time trying to help people understand this is a disease, but there's no other disease that we send to the jail for treatment. Okay, so we don't say, oh, you were diagnosed with cancer, we'll take you to the jail. You're diagnosed with diabetes, let's take you to the jail. Diagnosed with asthma, we'll take you to the jail. So it's unfortunate that they have, thank God they're there because it's all we have, but it's an unfortunate situation that we're really, our board is very committed to reversing.
I totally agree with her. Jail is not an appropriate default detox center.
My third question is, I know you play the drums. Are you planning on participating in Kahuna's Christmas jam in Alexandria this year?
He hasn't invited me. He must have seen me play, so
No, it's open to December 9th.
okay. I will write Big Kahuna.
The Toys for Tots thing.
Oh, yes.
Sixth grade.
I'll have to write that. I'll have to write that down. Yeah, that's my therapy as I try and play the drums.